Aachen, Germany, October 21, 1944. Just past noon, in a concrete air raid bunker at the northern edge of the ruined city, on a street called Lousbergstrasse, a German colonel named Gerhard Wilck sits underground with the last of his staff. Above him, the oldest coronation city in Germany has been reduced to a landscape of broken stone. Wilck commands what remains of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, and he holds a written order, passed down in the name of Adolf Hitler himself, that could not be more explicit. He is to hold the venerable imperial city of Aachen to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet. He is, if it comes to it, to let himself be buried under its ruins. Wilck had already promised his men exactly that. 2 days earlier, on the 19th of October, he had issued a written order of the day. The defenders of Aachen, he wrote, would prepare for their last battle. Constricted to the smallest possible space, they would fight to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet, in accordance with the Führer's orders. He closed it with the words, "Long live the Führer and our beloved fatherland." And there was more than his oath binding him. Before he slipped into the encircled city to take command, Wilck had been made to sign a document that authorized the Gestapo to arrest and even execute his wife and his children if he surrendered. Everything in his world, his oath, his orders, the lives of his own family, pointed toward death in that bunker. And then he surrendered anyway. He did not surrender because he had been cleverly outmaneuvered in some grand battle of movement. He did not surrender because a superior force had stormed his command post and put a rifle to his chest. He surrendered because, in the words of the final radio message his headquarters sent out that morning, all the ammunition was gone after severe house-to-house fighting. There was no water and no food. The enemy was close to the command post of the last defenders of the imperial city. Afterward, standing on the hood of an American jeep to address his captured men, Wilck said it plainly. He had been forced to surrender because they had run out of ammunition, food, and water. He had, he admitted, acted against orders. He had been supposed to fight to the last man. Here is the strange part. The men who took the city from him were the American 1st Infantry Division, the outfit the whole United States Army knew as the Big Red One. And to storm Aachen proper, the division had only 2 battalions of infantry available, fewer than 1,100 combat infantrymen, to take Charlemagne's capital, a fortress city that Hitler had ordered defended to the point of annihilation. On paper, the defenders inside the city were not badly outnumbered by the men actually clearing it. And still it was the defenders who ended up dead, captured, or pleading for permission to break out. So this is the question worth sitting with. How does a garrison ordered to die in place, holding a stone city built across centuries and ringed by fortifications, lose that city to a pair of understrength battalions in a matter of days? And why, when it was over, did German officer after German officer, from the colonel in the bunker up through the generals who wrote their accounts for the American army after the war, describe the defeat not as a failure of courage, and not even, really, as a failure of tactics, but as something closer to being ground down by a machine they had no way to answer? The easy explanations are the wrong ones. It was not that the German soldier in Aachen was a coward. He was not. Many of the men in that garrison fought with a stubbornness that appalled and impressed the Americans, who had to dig them out cellar by cellar. It was not that the Germans were hopelessly outnumbered in the city itself, because they were not. It was not a simple matter of superior German tanks beaten by superior American tanks, and it was not that the Americans had unveiled some secret wonder weapon. The real answer is quieter and, in the long run, far more decisive. It has to do with 2 completely different theories of how a battle is won. One was built around the will, the skill, and the initiative of the man at the front. The other was built around a system that could deliver overwhelming, coordinated firepower onto any point on the map faster than any German commander believed possible. To understand what the German officers admitted after Aachen, you first have to understand what the city was, why Hitler cared about it so much, and what the men defending it actually thought they were doing. Start with the city itself, because it is easy to underestimate what Aachen meant to the men on both sides of the wire. To an American rifleman in the autumn of 1944, Aachen was one grimier industrial town in the way of the Rhine. But to the German High Command, and to the propaganda machine behind it, Aachen was very nearly sacred ground. This was the city of Charlemagne. For close to 600 years, from the crowning of Otto I in the year 936 to the last coronation there in 1531, roughly 30 German kings had been anointed and enthroned in Aachen, taking their seat on the ancient marble throne of Charlemagne. It was the ceremonial heart of what Germans called the First Reich, the old empire whose 1,000-year span Hitler consciously echoed when he promised that his own regime would last 1,000 years. To strike at Aachen was to strike at a symbol of that faith. The official United States Army history put it in almost exactly those terms. Aachen, it wrote, represented the Holy Roman Empire. It represented the First Reich. There was another layer to it. Aachen would be the first great German city to fall to an enemy from the west. You have to reach back to the age of Napoleon to find the last time a major German city had been taken by a foreign army. For the Nazi leadership, the fall of Aachen would not merely be the loss of a road junction, it would be a crack in a myth. It would be the enemy setting foot, and staying, on old German soil, on the ground of the empire itself. That is why Hitler declared the place a fortress, and ordered it held at any cost. And here is the irony that sits underneath the entire battle. Militarily, Aachen was not much of a prize at all. The same official American history that recorded its symbolic weight was blunt about its practical value. The city of Aachen, it wrote, had little to recommend it. Lying in a saucer-like depression surrounded by hills, Aachen is no natural fortress. The high ground that mattered ringed the city from the outside. The town itself sat in a bowl. The American First Army commander, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, had at first hoped to avoid a direct fight for the place altogether. He believed it was held only by a small garrison that would presumably give up once it was cut off and isolated. If you were thinking purely as a soldier, and not as a keeper of symbols, the sensible course was to surround Aachen, seal it off, and keep driving east for the Rhine and the great industrial heart of the Ruhr beyond it. The argument for taking the city at all was never really about the city. It was about the road network, about protecting the flank of the larger offensive, and about not leaving a fortified enemy block sitting astride the advance. The symbol cut both ways. The Germans would bleed to hold it because of what it meant. The Americans would eventually decide they could not simply ignore a defended fortress at their back. Now place the city in the ground around it. Aachen sat inside the west wall, the deep belt of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and dragon's teeth that the Allies called the Siegfried Line. Here, the west wall ran in two bands. A thinner forward line, the Scharnhorst Line, lay to the west. A heavier, deeper line, the Schill Line, lay to the east, behind the city. Aachen was nestled between them. Beyond the city stretched flatter, more open country, the so-called Aachen Gap, and that gap pointed like an arrow toward the Ruhr. Break through cleanly here, and the road into the German industrial core lay open. That strategic promise is what pulled two American corps toward the same city from two different directions. The plan was a pincer. From the south and the southeast, the 7th Corps, under Major General Joseph Lawton Collins, a commander his troops nicknamed Lightning Joe, would swing around and above the city. Its spearhead for the encirclement was the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, under Major General Clarence Huebner, supported by armor and by the 9th Infantry Division. From the north, the 19th Corps, under Major General Charles Corlett, would drive the other arm of the pincer. The hard, grinding job of breaching the west wall there fell to the 30th Infantry Division, under Major General Leland Hobbs. The idea was for the two divisions, the 1st coming up from the south and the 30th coming down from the north, to meet behind Aachen, close the ring, and cut the garrison off from any hope of rescue. The men assigned to actually clear the city were a single regiment of the Big Red One, the 26th Infantry, under Colonel John Seitz, and within that regiment, 2 battalions carried the weight. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniels' 2nd Battalion would grind through the dense built-up centre. Lieutenant Colonel John Corley's 3rd Battalion would fight for the factory district on the northeastern edge and then push for the high ground on the northern rim, the ridges and parks that overlooked everything. Both officers had led these same battalions since before the invasion of Sicily. They were not beginners, but their formations, like most American units by the autumn of 1944, had been hollowed out by the summer's fighting and refilled with new men. By the 1st of October, more than 70% of the division's soldiers were replacements. During the lull before the assault, the veterans spent their time on something telling. They drilled the newcomers in the unglamorous mechanics of village fighting and the handling of their weapons. Hold on to that detail, because the American way of war, about to be unleashed on Aachen, was not a matter of individual brilliance. It was a matter of drilled, repeatable procedure that even a division full of replacements could still carry out. On the other side of the wire stood the German command structure, and it ran a long way up. Local defense fell to the 81st Corps, which by October was led by General Friedrich Köckling. Above him sat the 7th Army, then Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, and above them all, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, brought back out of retirement as Commander-in-Chief in the West. On paper, Köckling's corps counted several divisions and something like 18,000 men across the whole sector. But by this late stage of the war, numbers on paper and combat power on the ground were two very different things. Many of these formations were rebuilt shells, stitched together from the survivors of the summer disasters in France, padded out with fortress troops, with Luftwaffe and Navy personnel converted into infantry, and with the hastily raised units the Germans called Volksgrenadiers. Those new divisions looked substantial on an organization chart, but only about a quarter of their men were seasoned veterans. Roughly half were fresh conscripts and recovering wounded, and the rest were transfers combed out of the Air Force and the Navy. Some of Wilck's own men had received fewer than 10 days of infantry training. Inside the city, the garrison that Colonel Wilck would eventually command numbered something on the order of 5,000 men at the outset of the street fighting. It was a mixed bag. There were his own Volksgrenadiers, there were assorted fortress and rear area units, and there were even something over 100 Aachen city policemen pressed into the defense, later joined by a group of policemen who had slipped in from Cologne. His armor amounted to no more than a handful of tanks, perhaps 5, supported by a modest number of assault guns and a small collection of field pieces and howitzers. This was not a mechanized juggernaut. It was a defensive garrison, dug into a stone city, ordered to hold to the death, and counting on a rescue from the outside that would never quite arrive. Before we get to the street fighting, we have to go back a few weeks, to September, and to a German general whose actions have become one of the most argued about episodes of the entire battle. Because the First Battle of Aachen very nearly ended without a real battle at all. In early September 1944, the German front in the West was closer to collapse than at almost any other point in the war. The retreat from France had turned into a rout. Formations that had once been proud divisions were down to a few hundred exhausted men. On the 10th of September, the leading elements of the Big Red One, including an armored task force, pushed against the southern edge of Aachen and found, at first, that the belts of bunkers and obstacles were largely deserted. They pressed on eastward, toward the town of Stolberg, meeting stiffening resistance, and settled into an arc around the southern perimeter of the city. Into this crisis came the remnants of the 116th Panzer Division, a formation nicknamed the Greyhound Division, under General Gerhard von Schwerin. His division was a wreck, reduced to something like 600 men and a dozen tanks with no artillery worth the name. Schwerin looked at the chaos around him and concluded that the city could not, and should not, be defended in the panic of the moment. A general evacuation of the civilian population had been ordered, and it had collapsed into confusion, with terrified civilians clogging the roads. Schwerin did something remarkable. He halted the evacuation, and then, believing the Americans were about to walk into Aachen at any hour, he wrote a note, in English, and left it behind to be handed to the first American commander who arrived. The official American history preserved its text. In it, Schwerin wrote that he had stopped the absurd evacuation of the town, that he therefore felt responsible for the fate of its inhabitants, and he asked the Americans, in the event they occupied the city, to take care of the unfortunate population in a humane way. He signed it as the last German commanding officer in the sector. But the Americans did not walk in that day. The advance paused. American supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, fuel and ammunition were short, and priority was shifting to operations elsewhere. That pause was fatal for Schwerin's gamble, and very nearly fatal for Schwerin himself. Because the Americans did not arrive to receive it, the note he had written for them, instead, fell into German hands. To the Nazi authorities, a general who had halted a Führer, ordered evacuation, and penned a courteous surrender note to the enemy, was not a realist. He was a traitor. Hitler ordered his arrest. Schwerin was relieved of command and narrowly escaped the full machinery of Nazi vengeance, protected in part by senior officers and by the sheer confusion at the front. He survived with his career damaged rather than his life ended, and was later sent to fight in Italy. In the decades since, historians have argued at length over his motives and his conduct, and the tidy image of a noble saviour of Aachen has not gone unchallenged. What is not in dispute is the effect his gesture had on everything that followed, because the Schwerin affair hardened the German posture completely. The lesson the Nazi leadership drew was that Aachen had nearly been handed away, and that only ruthlessness would keep it from happening again. From that point on, the order to hold the city to the last man was enforced with a special ferocity, backed by explicit threats against the families of any commander who wavered. The reasonable path, sealing the city and sparing it, was now closed off by ideology. Aachen would be held as a symbol, and it would be defended by men who knew their loved ones could be made to pay for their surrender. The stage was set not for a rational defense, but for a fight to destruction. Through the rest of September and into October, the Germans used the American pause to feed reinforcements back into the sector. What might have been an almost undefended walkover in early September became, a few weeks later, a fortified position that had to be stormed. This is one of the quiet tragedies threaded through the whole battle. The delay that doomed Schwerin's gamble also guaranteed that when the Americans finally came, they would have to fight for every street. The encirclement began in earnest at the start of October. On the 2nd of October, the 30th Infantry Division to the north launched its attack to breach the west wall and cross the Würm River. This was brutal, unglamorous work, infantry and combat engineers going up against concrete pillboxes one at a time, and it cost the 30th dearly over the following weeks. The Germans fought back hard and counterattacked with armour. In one 2-day stretch of that fighting, on the 9th and 10th of October, the 30th Division claimed the destruction of 20 German tanks, a dozen of them knocked out by its own 105mm howitzers, 5 more by supporting tanks and tank destroyers, and 3 by infantrymen with bazookas. That accounting is worth pausing on, because it is a small preview of the larger story. Even German armour, thrown against the northern pincer, was being broken up in large part by American artillery firing in support. The cost ran both ways. On the 9th of October, a battalion of the 30th Division's 120th Infantry Regiment was ordered to take the fortified village of Berck, a few miles north of Aachen. One of its rifle companies, under a captain named Murray Pulver, attacked across some 400 yards of open ground alongside a sister company and a handful of supporting tanks. The attackers had barely covered half that distance when the field erupted with German artillery, rifle, and machine gun fire, and the supporting tanks were knocked out within minutes of crossing the line of departure. This was the texture of the fighting on the approaches, long before anyone reached the city centre. Open ground, prepared German fire, and a steady, grinding, expensive advance. From the south, the 1st Infantry Division began its own attack northward on the 8th of October. The 18th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel George Smith, seized a string of key positions in a rapid drive, taking the village of Verlautenheide, then a piece of high ground crowned by a crucifix that the Americans came to call Crucifix Hill, and then the Ravelsberg Heights, all inside roughly 48 hours. Crucifix Hill produced one of the battle's authentic acts of individual heroism, and it is worth telling because it stands in such sharp contrast to the impersonal machine that would define the larger fight. A company commander in the 18th Infantry, Captain Bobby Brown, went after the German pillboxes on that hill personally, with pole charges, explosive charges, fixed to the end of a length of pipe that a man has to carry right up to the firing slit of a bunker and shove into place. Brown knocked out 3 of them himself, was wounded more than once in the process, and kept going. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Hold that image for a moment. The war still had room in it for a single determined man with an explosive charge on a stick to change the course of a fight. Remember it, because the thing that ultimately killed the Germans inside Aachen was, in a sense, the opposite of Bobby Brown. It was not one heroic man, it was a system. By the 16th of October, the 2 arms of the pincer met near the town of Huertgen, north of the city. Patrols from the 1st and 30th Divisions made contact, and the ring around Aachen closed. The garrison inside was now cut off from the rest of the German army. From this point on, everything depended on 2 things. Could the Germans outside break back in to rescue the garrison, and could the garrison inside hold long enough for that rescue to arrive? But before the final assault into the built-up center, the Americans did something that the laws and customs of war encouraged, and that also, frankly, offered the defenders a way out. On the 10th of October, they delivered an ultimatum. 2 American lieutenants and an enlisted man, carrying a white flag, walked into the German lines bearing a written demand for surrender. The document was direct. It stated that the city of Aachen was now completely surrounded by American forces. It warned that if the city were not promptly and completely surrendered, unconditionally, the American ground and air forces would proceed ruthlessly, with air and artillery bombardment, to reduce it to submission. The message was, in effect, a preview of the mechanism about to be applied. It told the Germans exactly what was coming. Overwhelming firepower, delivered without mercy, poured onto the city. The German officer holding acting command at that moment, a lieutenant colonel named Leher, dutifully rejected the ultimatum in accordance with Hitler's standing orders. When the deadline expired on the 11th of October, the Americans made good on the threat. Roughly 300 fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command struck the city, dropping more than 60 tons of bombs. 12 battalions of American artillery joined in. On that single day, the division and corps guns together hurled something on the order of 169 tons of steel into Aachen, sinking the city center beneath a shroud of black smoke and dust. And this was before the infantry had truly begun to fight for the center at all. During the cold, wet night that followed, on the 12th of October, a lone German staff car slipped into the besieged city, carrying Colonel Gerhard Wilck to take formal command of the doomed garrison. He set up his headquarters, at first, in a grand former hotel on the northern edge of town, the Palast Hotel Quellenhof in Fahrig Park. He had already grasped how hopeless his position was. The hills that ringed the city would let the enemy look down on him at all times, and enemy aircraft roamed the skies unopposed. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter, the actual fight for the streets, and the American method that broke the German defense. Because this is where the 2 theories of war met head-on, and where the German officers' later admissions came from. The assault into the city proper opened around the 13th of October. Corley's 3rd Battalion had already begun clawing into the northeastern factory district, and Daniel's 2nd Battalion now attacked into the center. What Daniel devised, and what his men executed, became a textbook example that the American army would study for decades afterward. He refused to let his infantry fight the Germans on the Germans' preferred terms, which was a confusing close-range brawl among the ruins, where a single hidden defender with a rifle or a machine gun could exact a terrible price on advancing riflemen. Instead, Daniel turned the assault into a methodical, almost industrial procedure. It began with fire, layered by distance. Daniel used his mortars and light artillery to drop rounds from about 100 to 300 yards ahead of his men, medium artillery to work the belt from 300 to 500 yards out, and heavy artillery and aircraft to strike everything beyond that. At one early obstacle, a railway embankment cutting across the line of advance, two of his rifle companies flung something like 1,000 hand grenades over the top before they went up and over it themselves with their supporting tanks. Then came the grinding street work. Daniel broke his battalion into small assault teams. Each infantry platoon was paired with a tank or a tank destroyer. The armored vehicle would pour fire into a building, every building, whether or not anyone had confirmed the enemy was inside it. The working assumption was simple and ruthless. Every structure was treated as occupied until it had been proven otherwise. Machine guns swept the streets to keep the defenders' heads down and to drive them off the upper floors and down into the cellars. Once the Germans had been pushed into the basements, American infantry moved in with grenades and, where necessary, with flamethrowers handled by two-man teams to clear them out. Daniel gave the whole approach a grim, memorable slogan, "Knock them all down." The Americans even located the manholes in the streets and blocked them, sealing the sewers, because they had learned that the Germans would use the underground network to slip behind the advancing line and reappear in the rear. One participant described the whole nightmarish business as a fight that went from attic to attic and from sewer to sewer, and when a building was simply too strong to crack with tank fire, when it was a heavy stone apartment block or a reinforced air raid shelter, the Americans brought forward the single most emblematic weapon of the entire Aachen fight. A self-propelled 155mm gun, a piece of artillery designed to smash fortifications from miles away, was hauled right up to the front line and fired directly down the street, at point-blank range, into the offending building. The official history records that a single shell from this gun practically leveled one of the sturdy structures the infantry had been unable to take. The same weapon was used to punch clean holes through the walls between adjoining buildings, so that American infantry could move from house to house through the interiors, blasting their own doorways as they went, without ever exposing themselves in the fire-swept streets. The soldiers called this mouse holing. Sit with what that meant for a moment. The Germans had prepared to defend a city street by street. Their entire concept of urban defense assumed that the attacker would have to come to them, through the doors and the windows and the streets, into the killing zones they had carefully prepared, where German training and German initiative and German courage could tell. The American method simply refused the premise. Rather than step into the killing zone, the Americans destroyed the room around the German. They did not so much clear a building as delete it. The volume of firepower was staggering, and it was deliberately, doctrinally excessive. Daniel's battalion alone, in the fight for the city, fired something like 5,000 mortar rounds, 40,000 rounds of 30 caliber machine gun ammunition, and 27,000 rounds of small arms fire. It threw more than 4,000 hand grenades and burned through 50 gallons of flamethrower fuel. This was not the careful, ammunition-conserving fire of an army trained to shoot only at confirmed targets. This was an army that had decided, as a matter of settled policy, that it would rather spend shells than lives. While Daniel ground through the center, Corley's 3rd Battalion fought for the high ground on the northern rim. The key terrain there included a wooded height the Germans used for observation, along with adjacent rises, several fortified churches, and a park. In that park stood Wilck's Grand Hotel headquarters, the Quellenhof. The fighting for that corner of the city became some of the most savage of the entire battle. On the 15th of October, a battalion of Waffen-SS men, under an officer named Rink, infiltrated into the city through a gap the Americans had not yet fully sealed, and the next day threw itself against Corley's battalion in a fierce counterattack that briefly retook ground before the American line held, and the attack was smashed by concentrated artillery. Around the same time, American companies fought their way through a cluster of garden buildings and seized the Kurhaus, and elsewhere pressed past a church and into Farwick Park itself, close enough to the German headquarters that Wilck, already shaken by the pounding of the heavy guns, was alarmed to see American troops so near. He called for reinforcements and hastily shifted his command post from the exposed hotel to the sturdier air raid bunker where he would eventually surrender. Days later, an American platoon under Lieutenant William Ratchford stormed into the Quellenhof's lobby. The fight came down to hand grenade duels at the entrances to the basement, where the last defenders had gone to ground. When it ended, 25 Germans lay dead in the building, and the Americans discovered that the defenders had manhandled a 20mm gun up the stairs, carrying it piece by piece to fire it from the upper floors. Through all of this, the civilians who remained in Aachen endured a special horror. Of a pre-war population of about 165,000, only some 20,000 were still in the city, many of them too frightened or too slow to have gotten out. They cowered in the same cellars and air raid shelters that the soldiers used as strongpoints, which meant they often found themselves sheltering inside the very structures the Americans were systematically demolishing. American military government units pulled thousands of civilians out of the fighting and moved them to a suburb to the east, but for those still trapped in the combat zone, the industrial method that was breaking the German defense fell on them too. And through all of this, the Germans outside the ring were trying desperately to break back in and rescue the garrison. Here we come to what would become one of the central admissions of the German commanders after the battle. The relief attempts failed, and they failed in a very particular way. The German counterattacks, mounted by formations like the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the rebuilt 116th Panzer Division, went in piecemeal. Instead of massing their strength and striking one decisive, coordinated blow, the Germans fed their units into the fight in fragments, a couple of reinforced battalions at a time, reacting to one crisis after another. They gained some ground here and there at first, and then the attacks stalled, again and again, under concentrated American artillery fire and air attack. The official American history, drawing on the captured German records and the accounts the German commanders themselves wrote after the war, described this with a memorable phrase. A never-ending compulsion to stave off recurring crises, it wrote, had sucked the enemy's units into the abyss of piecemeal commitment. The attacks on the 18th and 19th of October, it noted, once again lacked coordination. The Germans committed the equivalent of some 20 battalions in counterattacks against the 30th Division alone, and yet rarely was any single attack made by more than about 2 reinforced battalions at a time. Strength arrived, but never all at once, and never in sufficient weight at the decisive point. It was bled away in installments. Why does that matter so much? Because it points straight at the deepest difference between the two armies, and at what the Germans themselves eventually understood about their own defeat. To see it fully, we have to leave the rubble of Aachen for a moment and ask where the American way of fighting this battle actually came from. Because it did not come from Aachen, and it did not even come from Normandy. It came from decisions made years earlier, in a very different American army. If this account is holding your attention, and if you care about the parts of the Second World War that rarely make it into the familiar retellings, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history find the people who want it. The American army that fought at Aachen was the product of an institution that had spent the years between the wars as a marginal, underfunded afterthought in its own country. Through the late 1930s, the United States Army ranked far down the list of the world's armies by size, smaller than the armies of several minor powers, starved of money across the long years of the Great Depression. It had little prestige and even less political support. But in certain quiet corners of that neglected institution, a particular habit of mind had taken root. It was the habit of taking the hard lessons of the previous war seriously, and of building systems, rather than relying on the brilliance of individual commanders to solve the problems those lessons revealed. One of those problems was the coordination of artillery. In the years before the war, at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, in Oklahoma, American officers worked out a method of fire direction that most of the world's artillery experts regarded, at the time, with polite skepticism. The idea was to centralize the control of many separate batteries through a single coordinating center that could compute firing solutions for all of them at once. In practice, this meant that one observer, far forward, looking at a target, could call for the concentrated fire of many guns, even an entire division's worth of artillery, brought down onto a single location almost simultaneously. The Americans called the capability that grew out of this work by a simple name: time on target. It meant that shells fired from many different guns, standing at many different distances, could be timed to all arrive at the same spot in the same instant, with no warning at all, giving the men on the receiving end no chance to take cover before the first rounds landed. Layered on top of this was a doctrine about the infantry's own weapons and a rifle built to match it. Between the wars, American infantry thinking had absorbed a blunt lesson from studies of combat in the First World War. On a modern battlefield, the enemy is mostly invisible. He is in a trench, behind a wall, inside a building, down in a cellar. The old picture of two lines of men trading aimed fire at each other across open ground had almost nothing to do with the reality, in which most of the fire on both sides was directed at suspected positions rather than at clearly seen men. The American response was to build an army that could put out a heavy volume of fire against those suspected positions, rather than one that hoarded its ammunition for the rare clear target. To do that, the army adopted, in 1936, the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle, and the only such weapon to serve as the standard infantry rifle of any major army in the entire war. A trained American rifleman could fire far faster than his German counterpart, working the bolt of his rifle by hand. Multiply that across a squad, and an American rifle squad could throw down a wall of fire that a comparable German squad simply could not match. Put these pieces together, and you have the mechanism that destroyed the defense of Aachen. The German soldiers' entire theory of combat, from the individual rifleman up to the corps commander, rested on a kind of determinism. The man who was well positioned, well concealed, and well led would prevail, and the initiative of the commander on the spot was the decisive instrument of the whole enterprise. This was the essence of the German command philosophy, often called mission tactics, in which higher command set the objective and then trusted the local commander to use his own judgment and aggression to achieve it. It produced, throughout the war, extraordinary small unit leadership and ferocious local counterattacks. At the level of the individual fight, it was often brilliant, but at its core, it was a theory that depended on the man at the front. And the American theory had quietly stopped depending on the man at the front for the thing that mattered most, the delivery of decisive firepower. The American theory was probabilistic and systematic. It did not ask the lieutenant on the spot to be brilliant. It asked him only to identify, with reasonable confidence, roughly where the enemy probably was, and then to reach for a radio and call down, within minutes, more concentrated firepower than any German battery could hope to assemble in the same span of time. The genius, such as it was, had been designed into the system years earlier, far from any battlefield, by officers most of the men firing the guns had never heard of, and it was available to a mere lieutenant, not reserved for a general's grand plan. This is the deepest reason the German relief attacks came in piecemeal, while the Americans always seemed to have overwhelming fire exactly where it was needed. The German system, for all its tactical brilliance, could not concentrate its power quickly enough. German artillery doctrine leaned on pre-surveyed positions and deliberate calculation. An unexpected threat from an unanticipated direction could take many long minutes before the German guns were able to respond at all. The American system could mass the fire of dozens of guns onto a fresh target in a handful of minutes at the request of a junior officer with a field radio. So when the Germans attacked in fragments, it was not only a failure of nerve or planning, it was that they were operating inside a slower, more manual system, forever reacting to crises that the faster American system kept generating, and never quite able to gather themselves for the single massed blow that might have broken the ring. Now consider the experience of the battle from the German side of the rubble, not through any one invented man, but as the common lot of the defenders. A German soldier in Aachen might be brave. He might be well concealed. He might have a strong stone building around him, exactly the kind of position his training told him should be defensible, from which he could make the attacker pay dearly to come and get him. And then he would discover that the Americans had no intention of coming to get him on his terms at all. A tank fired into his building as a matter of routine, before anyone had even confirmed he was there. Machine gun fire lashed the windows and drove him into the cellar. And if the building still held, a self-propelled gun was dragged up the street to fire a 155mm shell directly into the wall, and the room he was sheltering in simply ceased to exist. His courage was irrelevant. His concealment was irrelevant. His strong position was irrelevant. The Americans were not really fighting the man. They were deleting the ground he stood on. Colonel Wilck's admission came in the language of sheer physical exhaustion. His final messages did not argue tactics. They reported that the ammunition was gone, that there was no water and no food, that the enemy was upon his command post. He surrendered because there was, quite literally, nothing left with which to obey the order to die in place. And when he climbed onto the hood of that American jeep to address his captured men, he did not dress it up. He told them he had been forced to surrender because they had run out of ammunition, food, and water, that further fighting was useless, that he had acted against orders, and that he had been supposed to fight to the last man. This was not a general spinning excuses to save his reputation. It was a professional soldier stating flatly that the physical basis for further resistance had been annihilated. The higher German commanders, writing their accounts after the war for the American Army's historical program, reached for a more analytical version of the same admission. When they set out to explain why Aachen had fallen, they did not point first to any failure of the German soldier. They pointed to the American material machine. As a kind of formal explanation for the defeat, the German command pointed to two things above all. The first was unchallenged American air superiority over the battlefield. The second, and the more revealing, was the sheer imbalance in artillery. The Germans estimated that the Americans had brought some 86 batteries of guns to bear in the Aachen sector, against 69 German batteries. More telling still was their estimate of how much those guns fired. They reckoned the Americans were firing on the order of 9,300 rounds each day, against a German average of about 4,500. When the American official historian later checked that German claim against his own side's records, he found it only slightly exaggerated. The Germans, in other words, had accurately identified the thing that was killing them. It was not that the American soldier was braver, or that the American commander was more cunning. It was that the American army could put roughly twice as much steel into the air, delivered faster and coordinated more tightly than the German army had any means to answer. That is the admission that matters most, and it is worth stating precisely, because it is easy to flatten into a cliché. The German officers were not merely saying the enemy had more stuff. Every losing army in history has said that. They were identifying something more specific and more damning about their own way of war. They had built an army optimized for the initiative and skill of the man at the front, and it had met an army optimized for the coordinated delivery of overwhelming firepower by a system that did not much depend on any single man's brilliance. In the close fight, German soldiers often were the better fighters. Historians of the campaign have said as much without embarrassment. But it did not matter, because the American way of war had turned the close fight, the contest of skill and courage between individual soldiers, into something it could largely avoid. The Americans would rather knock the building down than fight the man inside it. And they had spent 15 unglamorous years building the artillery system, the rifle, and the doctrine to let them do exactly that. There is a further irony buried in the German command's own failures during the battle, one that sharpens the whole point. The Germans actually possessed, in isolation, most of the individual ingredients the Americans used. They had excellent artillery, arguably the equal of the American guns in quality. They had capable armor. They had, in their mission tactics, a command philosophy that produced superb local leadership. What they did not have was the integration, the ability to bring all of it to bear, coordinated, at the decisive point, at speed. Their reserves arrived in fragments, their guns reacted slowly, their counterattacks lacked coordination. The pieces were all there. The system that could fuse those pieces into a single hammer blow, quickly, at the call of a junior commander with a radio, was not. That is why an army that was frequently superior in the small fight lost the large one. Consider the arithmetic of the final tally. because it captures the asymmetry in cold numbers. When the city fell, the 1st Infantry Division reported its own losses for the whole fight as roughly 150 men killed and about 1,200 wounded. The 2 battalions of the 26th Infantry that actually cleared the city lost just under 500 men all told, of whom 75 were killed. Against that, the Americans took an enormous haul of prisoners. Across the wider battle for the sector, the 30th Division took around 6,000 prisoners, and the 1st Division took another 5,637, of whom roughly 3,473 were captured inside the city itself. On the final morning, the 21st of October, the German holdouts in the Technical University surrendered to Daniel's battalion after fighting through the dawn, and by nightfall, American troops had swept the city and rounded up on the order of 1,600 more men. The German garrison that had been ordered to fight to the last man was, in the end, very largely marched into captivity, and the men who did that marching had paid a price that was real and painful, but strikingly small, set against the scale of the German loss. The imbalance in the butcher's bill was simply the arithmetic expression of the imbalance in firepower, and the city itself. Aachen, the ancient coronation seat of the old empire, the symbol Hitler had ordered held to the point of self-immolation, was a corpse of a city by the end. Even before the ground assault reached the center, dozens of bombing raids had already destroyed close to half of the city's buildings and damaged much of the rest. By the time it fell, the great majority of Aachen lay in ruins, more than 80% of it wrecked. One American observer, surveying what was left, wrote that the city was as dead as a Roman ruin, but that, unlike a ruin, it had none of the grace of gradual decay. The symbol had been defended into oblivion, held to the last, and destroyed in the holding. That destruction points to the final, bitter piece of the German admission, and it is not only a military one. The order to hold Aachen at all costs had never been a military judgment. Every professional instinct, on both sides, said that a city in a bowl, of little real military value, ringed by high ground, should either be sealed off or given up, rather than turned into a fortress. The decision to defend it to annihilation was political and symbolic, driven from the very top and enforced by threats against the families of the officers who had to carry it out. General Schwerin had seen all of that clearly back in September, and his attempt to spare the place had nearly cost him his life. The men who came after him defended the city as ordered, and in doing so they proved exactly what Schwerin had understood. Holding Aachen was never a way to win anything. It was a way to feed a garrison and a city into a machine that would grind both to powder for the sake of a symbol. The aftermath followed the men into captivity. Wilck himself, an experienced but otherwise unremarkable officer of 49, was taken away to be questioned, and eventually to a prisoner of war camp for senior German officers in England. As his captured troops were finally locked away, correspondents watched the colonel's composure break, and the stern professional wept. Back in Germany, the propaganda machine that had demanded the city be held to the last man now turned on the man who had surrendered it. The Nazi authorities produced a leaflet featuring Wilck's photograph under the headline that he bore the guilt, blaming him for the destruction of Aachen and accusing him of surrendering only to save his own skin. Wilck survived all of it. He lived another 40 years, dying in Germany in 1985. The city he had been ordered to be buried under outlived him too, rebuilt from its rubble in the decades after the war. Aachen showed what the American system could do when the conditions let it work. But it would be a mistake to walk away thinking that system was invincible, or that it guaranteed victory wherever the American army went. The proof was taking shape at the very same time, only a few miles to the south, in a stretch of dense woodland that would become one of the most costly and most bitterly questioned battles the United States Army ever fought. It was called the Hurtgen Forest. The same First Army under Courtney Hodges that reduced Aachen also pushed, all through the autumn of 1944, into the Huertgen, a block of dark fir forest of some 50 square miles lying southeast of the city. The reasons were partly sound, and partly, in hindsight, a grave error. The forest sat on the flank of the drive toward the Ruhr River and American commanders were unwilling to leave it in German hands as they advanced. But the ground that truly mattered was not really the forest at all. It was a pair of dams on the Ruhr, the Schwammenau and the Urft, which the Germans could open to flood the river valley and trap any force that had crossed downstream. That crucial fact was recognized late. The dams did not become a firm objective until November, and they were not taken until February of 1945, by which point the Germans had wrecked the discharge machinery and flooded the valley anyway. In other words, the American army poured its strength into the trees, while the terrain that actually decided the campaign went unrecognized for weeks and uncaptured for months, and the forest did something to the American way of war that Aachen never had. It took the system apart, piece by piece. Every advantage that had made the Big Red One unstoppable in the city was stripped away by the terrain. The dense canopy hid everything beneath it, and the cold, wet, fog-bound weather grounded the aircraft, so the air superiority that had roamed freely over Aachen was all but useless over the Huertgen. The tanks that had rolled up to Aachen's buildings to fire point blank were now confined to a handful of narrow, muddy logging trails, where they bogged down, through their tracks, and were picked off one by one, unable to leave the path. The most infamous of those tracks, the Kal Trail, became a graveyard of stranded armor. But the cruelest reversal was the artillery. In Aachen, massed American artillery had been the great equalizer, the thing that let a lieutenant erase a defended building with a single radio call. In the Huertgen, that same artillery turned against the men advancing under it. Shells that struck the treetops burst in the air, showering steel fragments and jagged splinters of wood straight down onto whatever lay below. American infantry had been trained, sensibly, to throw themselves flat when shells came in. But lying flat in the Huertgen exposed a man's whole body to the fragments raining from above. The soldiers who survived learned to do the opposite of everything their instincts told them, to stand and press themselves against a tree trunk to shrink the target. And here is the heart of it. The German defender, dug into a hole with a roof of logs and earth over his head, was sheltered from those tree bursts. The exposed American attacker was not. The very weapon that had shattered the German defense of Aachen now protected the German defender and punished the American attacker instead. Observation, the thing every artillery system depends on, was nearly impossible beneath the canopy. So much of the fire that did come down could not even find the enemy. The United States Army's own official historian, Charles MacDonald, who had himself commanded a rifle company in that campaign, and so wrote with the authority of a man who had been inside it, delivered a verdict that has stood ever since. The real winner in the forest, he concluded, was the forest itself, a dark green sea that, in the words of that official history, virtually negated American superiority in air, artillery, and armor. He judged the whole battle a mistake from its very conception, a fight that need never have happened and should have been avoided. General James Gavin, who later took his airborne troops into the same ground, called it one of the most costly, most unproductive, and most ill-advised battles the American army had ever fought. The German commanders saw exactly the same thing from the other side, and said so plainly. The Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, Rudolf von Gersdorf, admitted after the war that the German command could not at first understand why the Americans kept attacking into the forest at all, because the fighting in the woods stripped the Americans of precisely the advantages in air power and armor that had been decisive in every earlier battle. For once, the German soldier's world made sense to him again. In the trees, the fight came back down to prepared positions, minefields, small groups of determined men, and local initiative, the very things the German army was still extraordinarily good at. The forest had, in effect, handed the German theory of war its ideal battlefield. The cost was staggering, and it was the mirror image of Aachen's arithmetic. Where the Big Red One had taken the imperial city for something like 1,500 casualties, the Hurtgen Forest consumed on the order of 33,000 American casualties across roughly 3 months, an estimated 24,000 from the fighting itself, and another 9,000 from the misery of the forest, from trench foot, pneumonia, and sheer exhaustion, a casualty rate approaching 1/3 of the men committed. Division after division was fed into the trees and ground down. The 9th Infantry Division gained about 3,000 yards in the early fighting, and paid, by the official reckoning, something close to 1.5 casualties for every single yard. The 28th Infantry Division's attack on the village of Schmidt in early November turned into an outright disaster, its regiments cut off across the Kal Gorge and hurled back by a German armoured counterattack, at a cost of more than 6,000 men in a matter of days. The 4th, the 8th, and the 1st Infantry Divisions were all bled in their turn. On one bare rise the Americans knew only by its height, Hill 400. A battalion of Rangers seized the crest and held it against furious counterattack, at a cost of roughly 4 in every 5 men who went up. One of their officers called the place a death factory. The Germans, too, lost heavily, something on the order of 28,000 men, but in the forest, unlike in the city, the Americans had no way to make the enemy pay a wildly lopsided price for it. And when the Hurtgen fighting finally ended, it ended only because a far larger German blow fell elsewhere. The battle in the forest was still grinding on when, on the 16th of December 1944, the Germans launched their great surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the attack the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, with the Ruhr dams still in German hands. The wrecked 28th Division, pulled out of the forest and sent to a supposedly quiet sector to rebuild, found itself squarely in the path of that offensive, struck a second time by some of the very same German units it had faced among the trees. So gather the threads and state the verdict cleanly. The German officer who defended Aachen did not fail as a soldier. In the small, sharp fights among the ruins, his men were often the better fighters, and their courage was never really in question. What failed him was the theory of war he had been raised inside. It was a theory that placed its faith in the man at the front, in his skill, his initiative, and his will to hold a strong position against all comers. The American army had, without ever quite announcing it, stopped fighting that kind of war. It had decided that the location of the enemy, the patch of ground he happened to occupy, was the real question, and that if you could put enough coordinated firepower onto that patch of ground, fast enough, the individual qualities of the man standing on it stopped mattering. One theory was about the man, the other was about the system, but the forest to the south is the reason that verdict has to be stated with care, because the American system was never magic, and it did not win by some law of nature. It won at Aachen because the conditions in and around the city allowed it to work, ground open enough and observation clear enough for the guns and the aircraft and the tanks to find their targets and bring their full weight down. Strip those conditions away, as the Huertgen did, and the very same army, with the same doctrine and the same weapons, bled just as helplessly as the Germans had bled in the city. The lesson the two battles teach together is not the simple one that the Americans were better soldiers than the Germans. It is that a way of war built on the coordinated delivery of overwhelming firepower is only ever as good as the conditions that let that firepower be delivered. In Aachen those conditions held, and the German defender died without ever being seen by the men who killed him. A few miles south, in the trees, they did not hold, and it was the American attacker who paid that same price instead. Both battlefields obeyed one underlying logic. Only the terrain decided which army it would destroy. Colonel Wilck walked out of his bunker and into captivity at 5 minutes past noon on the 21st of October, 1944. The order in his pocket had told him to let himself be buried under the ruins of the imperial city. He chose instead to hand over what was left of his garrison and to say out loud that he had done so against orders, because there was nothing left to fight with. His superiors would call that treason, but the men who wrote the honest accounts afterward, the German generals at their desks, tallying batteries and rounds and days of ammunition, understood something Wilck had felt in the bunker without quite being able to name. The thing that beat them at Aachen could not be answered by any amount of courage, because it had never been aimed at their courage in the first place. It had been aimed, patiently and from a long way off, at the ground beneath their feet. If this account of the fall of Aachen gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people who care about getting the history right, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep look into the parts of this war that the familiar stories tend to leave out.